Well, well, well. Look who decided to finally boot. This is a Sunfire V240, an entry to mid-level enterprise server that Sun Microsystems came out with in 2003. In a previous video, I did a walk around and we got it cleaned up, we got it running, everything seemed fine, except it wouldn't boot. So in this video, I'm gonna talk through all the different things we tried, and including something really interesting. A viewer has his own V240 and he actually imaged a disk on it. I took that image and put it on another SCSI drive with my other Sunfire. So that process is pretty interesting, and that did work. It's not ultimately what was wrong with this machine though. We'll go over that. We have a little foreshadowing of what might have been wrong right here. It's really important to have a good mental model of all the run levels these Sun enterprise servers have when you're dealing with them. So there's the lights off management, or advanced lights off management in the case of this Sunfire V240. There's also what's called the OK prompt, or the OpenBoot NVRAM prom and firmware. The LOM is like a computer inside this computer, and it's really useful to see how you move between those different prompts and how Solaris actually gets booted. So what I think I'm going to do to kick us off is talk about all the different run levels these things have and why you'd want to be in each one and why each one is important to have it working. Then we'll diagnose what exactly was going on with this thing, what we tried, and as you saw, we're booting. Let's get into it. All right, so Solaris, the Unix operating system that these Sunfires were intended to be running, has this notion of run levels. And for this conversation, talking about the lights out management, which I'll get into, getting into an OK prompt, I'll also talk about that, and then finally Solaris, we care about run level 0. So this is, the machine is ready to have its power plug pulled, basically. That's run level 0. We're going to lump all, there's other levels for the purposes of what we're up to and basically casual Sunfire use like I do. We'll lump all these together, it doesn't matter. But we're going to start at run level 0. So the machine is powered off. And in this state, these enterprise machines have something called the lights out management, or lights out manager, or LOM. There were a bunch of different versions, depending on how old your machine is. LOM, ALOM, ILOM, ELOM. And in fact, the 3 Sunfires I have all have a different version, but the ILOM could like host it in a web interface, for example. But for our purposes, they're all basically the same. They let you remotely power on and power off the machine. They do things like temperature checks, really, really basic hardware checks. And eventually you want to get into something called the OK prompt, which we'll discuss, and then ultimately Solaris. So the first thing that happens when you give a machine a Sunfire power is its LOM runs. And so I'll demonstrate that on my V120 in the server room. I'm going to actually go plug it in, and I'll pull up a terminal here and we'll see what it does. All right, so this terminal has a serial connection to the Sunfire V120. I'm going to go plug it into the wall. I wasn't joking. I'm literally going to plug it into the wall. I have my helper here. All right, so it's plugged in, but you'll see it's not turned on. It's just getting power. And so I have to do that with my funny extension cord setup, because this thing draws just enough surge when you power it on to flip this GFCI, and as you can imagine, the whole rack goes down. So we'll fix that in a video someday. So yeah, this thing's plugged in. Let's go look at the LOM. All right, so right when I plugged that machine in, the LOM module booted up, and you can see here we are. We can interact with it. This one's old, over 20 years old. And so the LOM is sort of the first thing a Sunfire does. You hit the LOM. Now, with the LOM, I can actually tell the machine to turn on, and that will get us to the OK prompt. All right, so the LOM is the first thing that starts up. And once we power on the server, the OpenBoot firmware will kick in. So when you're researching how to mess with your Sunfire or any of these Sun machines, OpenBoot is the name of the firmware that runs, and it gives you an OK prompt. Literally, OK is the prompt, and I'll show you that in just a second. And so the LOM is the very first thing that starts up, and you can get access to it to literally power on the server as if you're touching the power button. We're going to do that together on that V120. And then it's going to hop over to the OpenBoot firmware, which has a bunch of different variables you can set that control the behavior of startup. And these are stored in NVRAM, non-volatile random access memory. So it persists when the power is unplugged, essentially. And all these variables kind of determine different things about the system. So an important one when you're first firing up a Sun you just bought is this auto boot. This is whether or not it should boot right into Solaris if that exists on the system. There's a disk with Solaris. It also controls the boot device. So you can control booting directly off a disk, of course, a SCSI drive in our case. You can boot from the net to install Solaris on a disk. That's really useful. I've done that before. And of course, if you have a CD-ROM in, you can tell it to boot from CD-ROM and install Solaris that way. So this is the kind of stuff you can do with the OK prompt. And you can move between all these different prompts. So on my V120, I have Solaris on a disk. So it's a fully functional Sunfire with Solaris on it. And usually Sun's documentation is pretty good. They might have missed the mark with this one. But these are the three prompts you're moving between. And we have the LOM over here. This is also called, in the ALOM world, it's called the SC prompt. Sun has a million names for everything. And then over here, we've got the OpenBoot PROM or OK prompt. And over here is like Solaris actually running and you're at the Unix prompt. And you can get between them all. So right now on the V120, we're at the LOM. We're going to power it on first. You can't actually get to the OK prompt without the machine running. It relies on the actual, the CPU and the RAM and hardware to get everything working. And so we'll be able to power on the machine. And what's going to happen is we'll hop over here, OK prompt, and then we'll tell the machine to boot Solaris, and we'll end up at the Solaris prompt. And then throughout all that, I'll show you how you can drop back to the LOM with this #. Command, which you'll also see when you're Googling these things to try to figure out how to get your Sunfire to work. All right, clear as mud, right? So we're at the LOM, and now we're going to tell it, turn the machine on. It's the aptly named power on command. So now you can see stuff about NVRAM. It's dumping all sorts of other testing data that it's doing. We've actually hopped over to the OpenBoot PROM. We're at what's called run level 0. So we're not in Solaris, but the hardware is up, and it's going to run through all its tests. This will take a moment. We should see that the lights on the server are on now. Obviously, it's running, and we'll get to the OK prompt. All right, we're here. So now we're at the OK prompt, and as you can see, it literally is a prompt that says OK. And so you can do all sorts of interesting stuff here. So let's say you threw a drive in, you could run the probe SCSI command or even a card, and it'll go off and look for all the SCSI devices it knows about, all sorts of stuff. Most importantly, you can tell the machine to boot to Solaris and which disk to boot with. You can tell it to boot over the net on a jumpstart server, install Solaris that way. I've done videos on that and all sorts of stuff. So really great to be able to get in here. So yeah, we can see what all our NVRAM variables are set to. And now let's talk about hopping between prompts. So I can press the #, and I've hopped back to the LOM. Remember, it's kind of like another computer. So now I'm at the LOM. I can go back to the OK prompt. If I do console, I'm back. And most importantly, I can actually boot to Solaris. So remember, the machine's powered on, but it hasn't like booted into an OS or anything. I'm just at the OK prompt. And so finally now we can say boot, and it's already been configured. It knows it has one disk that has Solaris on it, the one that you probably saw in the little clip I showed of the machine earlier. And yeah, it's going to boot up. All right, 30 years later, our poor V120 is finally running Solaris. So we can log in as you would expect. And it is struggling. There it goes. Okay, so now, yeah, we're at the Solaris prompt. We can still get back to the LOM with #, and then back to Solaris with console again. So now we're in Solaris. We cannot get to the OK prompt without shutting Solaris down. You can't hop between Solaris and the OK prompt. But the LOM, remember, is its own little thing. It's like another computer. You can always get to it. And so, in order to get from Solaris back to the OK prompt, we have to shut things down. So we say init 0. Remember I was talking about run levels before? 0 is the machine's on, Solaris is shut down, and we're at the OK prompt. So we can say, that's what I want to do. This will shut Solaris down, and we'll be good. All right, another 30 years later, that poor machine. We're now back at the OK prompt. We're in the OpenBoot. And so we can power the system down. Well, if I'm in the, see how confusing it is? If I'm in the right space. So now I'm at the LOM. And with the power off command, you can see host power off. We're not going to get back to the OpenBoot because the system is not on. That's what this is trying to tell us. System is in standby. It says I can't go to the OK prompt because I need the power to be on and the CPU is running and all that. So that's my terrible tutorial, but we started at the LOM when we gave the machine power. We told it to power up, and that brought us to the OK prompt because my machine happens to not be set to auto boot. It just goes to the OK prompt. Then we told it to boot. That's what it's saying here at this arrow. It's saying, if you boot the machine, we ended up in Solaris. We hopped back and forth because you can hop back to the LOM from Solaris and then back over, of course. And then we issued an init 0. That brought us back to OK. Hopped over to the LOM and shut everything down again. So now let's talk about what was going on with that V240. All right, now that we're all experts at Sunfire boot up sequences, let's talk about the failure mode this guy was experiencing. So the ALOM would start up. I'm on the serial management port, and then nothing. It happened to be password protected, which I was kind of overly hyper-focused on, but that doesn't really matter. What's supposed to happen is you time out waiting for the password, power this thing on, and you should hit the OK prompt. But what I was seeing was nothing. So the first thing I did is dove in and took a look at the various jumpers on the board, hoping I could bypass the ALOM. Maybe that would get me to the OK prompt, try to reset settings. Nothing there ended up working. You can indeed turn off the ALOM, but in my case, no output whatsoever. And I should note, I was looking at both the DB9 serial coming out of the machine and the serial management port, and I only ever saw activity on the management port, and it was the ALOM. So at this point, it had been hours and hours of research and trying different things and jumper settings and various break commands as it starts up to try to get to the OK prompt, and it just wasn't behaving the way everything online said it should. And as our V120 example showed, when you power these things on, they should go to the OK prompt. That's what they're supposed to do. And so at this point, I was thinking, okay, maybe there's an NVRAM setting that's redirecting the display to something other than the serial port, because that can happen. So I picked up one of these XVR 600s in the small off chance that the previous owner was redirecting OK prompt output to a video card. I wasn't sure if this would be exactly how that would look, but I had this on the way from eBay, and then while I was looking at that video card, I was starting to realize it could be a pretty significant hardware failure, and it was actually pretty affordable to just get an entire other motherboard for the thing. So this was on the way. And so this would theoretically help because obviously it's a brand new OpenBoot and LOM chip on this entirely different board. While I was waiting on this stuff from eBay and tinkering around with other stuff, a viewer named Nathan, the same person that sent these compact SCSI drives my way, and also the guy that created the Sun 3D print drive sleds for these things, mentioned that he also has a V240 and he would image a disk for me, and I would try to take that image he sent me, put it on a real SCSI drive, pop it in here, and hope that we boot to Solaris. So that was a pretty interesting process and did ultimately work in terms of getting Solaris on this machine. So I think it'd be kind of cool to walk through that process together, and we'll get one of these drives imaged. All right, first things first, the image from the other V240 is 9 gigs. So we'll use a 9 gig drive here. You don't have to, but you're gonna waste the rest of the space, I think, if you don't. We'll throw these 3D printed rails on this and get it in the V120. All right, got that drive installed in the V120 here with the new rails on it. Let's go image it. All right, we are back at our friend, the OK prompt on the V120. Let's run probe SCSI. I just pushed that drive in there. And you can see it found a compact drive in slot 0. So now when we boot to Solaris, so that Solaris understands this new drive, you can boot with the -s argument, and it'll just auto configure, and we should have access and be able to format it and all that. All right, we're booted up into Solaris. We're logged in. Let's try the format command. It sees both disks, so my root, my disk with Solaris on it is this guy, and we're going to be interested in C0T0D0. That's the compact. So let's get out of there. First thing I'm going to do is I have the image on my TrueNAS NFS share. It's called this SOL10.img. This is super useful for dealing with these older computers, as you just mount an NFS share that you've got hosted somewhere and you can get files onto them. Highly recommend it if you're going to be messing around with this stuff. So let's mount that guy. It's at my TrueNAS instance locally. Okay. And then at our mount point, here we can see SOL10.img. Don't have to drag it onto the machine or anything. And now what we're going to do is use the dd command to copy this image exactly on, byte for byte, onto that compact disk. And this is what that looks like. You do dd if, I think it stands for in file. Let's point it at the Sol10 image. And then out file is going to be dev rdisk, and this is very important to target the correct disk. We're gonna target the compact, not the one that's running Solaris on this machine. COTODO. You're gonna want to target what's called stripe 2. I'm not going to pretend to understand all the stripes and all that, how that all works in Solaris, but I know that when you're imaging the disk, you target stripe 2, and later when we check it with fsic and mount it, we're going to target stripe 0. And I'll show you that in a minute. And we'll give it a block size of 128K. This version of DD is so old that it doesn't have the status equals progress. It won't spit out its progress. So this will take a little bit, and I'll be back. So you notice these disks in Solaris have these wild names, COTODO, COT1DO. And they're just following a Solaris naming convention that you can look up online here. All right, it's done. Don't be nervous if that takes a while. In my case, it took a full 15 minutes just for a 9 gig drive. I imagine it's more if the image is larger. And yeah, it's kind of nerve-wracking when there's no progress status output, but it finished. So now let's perform some rudimentary health checks on this thing. We'll do fsic dev rdisk COTODO stripe 0. It's going to go off and do some checks. We'll be back. All right, we're back and everything looks good. Took like 2 or 3 minutes or something. So now let's actually mount this disk here, have a look at its files because there's something clever on it. So the command is mount dev disk COTODO. And we'll put it in that folder. Okay, let's go have a look in there. And of course, this is just a Solaris install. But what's clever is Nathan, the guy that made the image. Remember the ALOM, the ALOM password, I don't know it on this machine. But once you're in Solaris, you're king of the castle. You can reset the password. And so he did something clever. There's a clever script that runs at init. So if we cat etc init.d reset alum pass, we can see that this command, which runs the scadm, scadmin utility, changes the admin password to one of our choosing. And when we boot this thing up at the end of the video here, you can see I was actually able to log into the ALOM after this script ran. So let's talk about what happened when I put this thing in the V240. All right, powered down our old workhorse here, earning our pay this week. Pop that drive out and get it in the V240. So I got that image disk in here in slot 0, powered it on, and wouldn't you know it, the same promptless void after the ALOM timeout. No OK prompt, no difference. I was starting to think, man, I'm going to have to swap the motherboard on this thing and start doing research about what that entails. And then I was kind of thinking, okay, well, maybe I should reseat some of the RAM chips or something. And I was talking with Nathan, the guy that made the image, and he said, hey, you know, how about you pull that CPU that didn't have the heatsink and see if someone ran it with it off. Maybe they fried it. And so if you'll recall, this machine came to me with one of the CPUs missing a heatsink. And so I pulled it out, and wouldn't you know it, this guy's fried. This thing booted up no problem, and I'll show you that now. So once the LOM boots up, I'm able to log in with the new password no problem. And when we power this thing on, fires right up, goes into the OK prompt, and as you'll see in a moment here after we speed through some of these checks, launches Solaris just fine. And we're in. Logging into this Solaris instance on this V240 was such a good feeling after days and days of struggling with it. Well, sometimes it's the simplest things. I should have been very suspicious of this CPU. A, it didn't have a heatsink in the first place, and B, if you'll recall, the writing on it was super faded. And I think that's because it had been run real hot without a heatsink by the previous owner. So yeah, I was worried about the motherboard and all this other stuff when I should have started with the basics, pull the stuff that is suspicious. You kind of get this idea in your head that something has to be a certain way, and my idea was this thing needed 2 processors, even when I did research for the previous video and found that a valid configuration from Sun was this to have 1 processor. And I still didn't think to pull it out until prompted by Nathan. Huge thank you to Nathan for the SCSI drives, the image of Solaris that I'm just going to use to run on this thing. It's pretty convenient to be able to image a drive like that. I hope you guys enjoyed following along and watching that. I learned a lot. I've learned a lot about how the OpenBoot PROM and LOM and Solaris all kind of work together now. I sort of understood, but I had to actually really teach myself to understand what was going on here and debug the fact that we weren't ever getting to an OK prompt. So I hope you guys found this interesting, and hopefully it's useful for you if you end up dabbling in these Sunfire machines. They're really fun to work on. All the LOM and OpenBoot and all the stuff, the surrounding ecosystem is super fascinating, and I think Sun had quite a bit going on there. Pretty interesting. So if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. I've got more of this Sun content, home lab content, general computing content, all sorts of stuff coming on the way, and it really motivates me as I see my subscriber count grow. Kind of keeps me in it. So anyway, in the meantime, I'll see you in the next one, and thanks for watching.